Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. It seems to me that one of the main issues that everyone keeps talking about is woke. What does woke mean? What does woke ideology mean? What does cancel culture mean? Why are people being punished for things that they say? Why do some groups seem to have superiority over other groups? Why does it seem that it's okay to be racist against certain groups and that certain groups are allowed different privileges that others aren't? Why does it seem that we've gone away from a colorblind society into something that we don't recognize, something that seems un-Western in its practicality and in the way it thinks? What's happening? And so for that, we want to talk to Professor Eric Kaufmann. He is the author of The Third Awakening, a 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism. And he's also someone who wrote a lot about the rise of populism and why immigration is such an issue in the West and in America and in Europe. And so Professor Kaufmann is someone who really knows this subject, and we're going to try and understand, what does woke culture mean? Why do people believe it? How do we combat it? How do we combat this perverse ideology? Professor Eric Kaufmann, it's a great honor to speak to you on the Western Spirit. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be here, Ariel.
So I want to talk to you about your new book. I haven't had a chance, I admit, to read the whole thing. I read your article that you wrote, I think, not too long ago, where you said that woke culture, cancel culture, is not going anywhere, and it might be even getting stronger, as I understood the gist of what you're saying. So maybe even before, it's something that I really cannot understand, and I think your book tries to explain it, is what exactly is woke culture? If you had to explain it in, I guess, something that someone like me could understand, because we feel it. We see the crazy people on campuses. We see
Right.
the cancel culture. We see the pronouns. But what is it?
So here's the thing. In one sentence, woke means the making sacred of historically disadvantaged race, gender, or sexual identity groups. And so that will include clearly groups like Black and Indigenous under the race category, trans, gay, for example, under the sexuality, sexuality and gender category, but also to some degree women as well. As this, this is sort of related to race, sex, and gender. So once you say these groups are sacred, then you're essentially saying anything you say that can be interpreted as offending, as making even the most sensitive imaginable member of one of these groups feel offended, and is essentially blasphemy. It's
Right.
like you have offended the gods. And so this is why you must be cast out of the community through what's called cancellation.
Could I just interject? Does that, but every group has some in its past, some sort of persecution. So I live in Israel. My grandparents were in the Holocaust, and I would have a giant family if there wasn't the Holocaust. My grandfather had, I think, 8 brothers and sisters. They all died except for him. My grandmother had something to that effect, and they all died too, except for 2 sisters, but all her other family died. And now I'm considered white adjacent in America. So I'm not a minority, that, like you just explained. So how do they decide? How does this woke culture? I think that's the most important question. Who decides which group is more oppressed and which group has more privilege?
So here's the thing, and I'm like you, I have, relatives who died in the Holocaust. But here's the thing to understand. What I want to try and get you to think about is not this as an ideology that grows from one idea influencing another idea, so much as a set of emotional charges and volume knobs that are adjusted for different particular groups. How did those volume knobs come to be cranked up to 10 for race, for example?
Right.
It happened very suddenly in the mid-1960s. Now, if you take Jews, there's a couple of things. I mean, the first thing is to say that they don't have zero oppression points. They have some oppression points. They just have fewer oppression points than, say, blacks do. So there is the Holocaust. That does count for something. And so you could be canceled if you say something like cultural Marxism or criticize George Soros.
Right.
Somebody can say you're a Nazi and you're anti-Semitic. So it does have some cancellation power. But a lot of this is a totem pole of who's higher up the totem pole and who's lower
Exactly.
down the totem pole right now. And that's established almost through a law of the jungle. Someone asserts a taboo. As long as people go along with it, they don't push back, it then becomes the new norm. The taboo around African Americans comes in very suddenly in the mid-60s, this anti-racism taboo. There's a book by a black conservative, excellent, very interesting book called White Guilt by Shelby Steele.
Right. Yeah.
And he says, he lived in the Jim Crow segregated South. He experienced the old-fashioned racism where black people have to defer to white people. And then suddenly in the mid-1960s in polite society, white people suddenly had to defer to black people and show they were one of the good whites and not one of those bad, nasty whites, that they saw on their TV screen from Alabama or something. So this really shifts the place of cultural power, Shelby Steele argues. Now, all of a sudden, the American institutions are having to show virtue signal that they have moral legitimacy. They haven't lost all their moral legitimacy by admitting to this sin of racism. So racism really becomes the taboo. And I say this is kind of the big bang of the moral order of the West, is the mid-1960s rise of this anti-racism taboo. That becomes the kind of sun around which the entire moral order orbits. Now, once you've got that sacredness around race, that can then be stretched in different ways. So maybe Latinos and other indigenous will try and moral that power. You will get even, by the way, the Northern Ireland Catholics styling themselves after the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement. You will have a Civil Rights Association. You'll have the Quebecois, the French Canadians borrowed that. They tried to claim they were the blacks of North America, of Canada. You then had, of course, the feminist movement. You had the gay rights movement, and they were all leaning into this template of a kind of identity politics victim group, hoping, therefore, that they could partake of some of this power, and they did. In fact, so sexism is a taboo. It's not as strong as anti-racism. The taboo against homophobia, the taboo against transphobia. These are all taboos that have a certain amount of power. Maybe not as large, but a certain amount of power. And it's that kind of emotional system. It's underpinned by movies, books. It could be initially To Kill a Mockingbird, although that's now something you can get canceled for actually teaching kids. But at the time, movies that portray, the good white, not the, he's the good white. He's fighting to protect the black person against the bad whites,
Right.
and Mississippi burning, something like this. This is sort of the mythology that underpins the emotions. And it's those emotions which I think are much more important than having a conversation about, Marxism going into postmodernism and all these other things.
One more thing that I just wanted to ask, or maybe just ask if you meant what I understood, is that there's a sort of like they call it intersectionality thing, where the best thing is that you check the most boxes. So if you're black and you're trans and you're or non-binary or all that, I don't even know what some of these things mean, to be frank.
Right.
So, but the more boxes you check, the more higher up on the, I guess, the identities that deserve our sympathies, or that you can't criticize, or that if you're perceived to criticize, then you're, like you said, canceled or persecuted. It's sort of like almost a religion in a way. The higher up on the social, the holier you are, the more you get punished if you say anything blasphemous against them. So
that's right. Yes.
Right.
And it's you put this intersectional thing is really, if you're black plus a woman plus a lesbian plus a trans, you're getting more points, rising up that totem pole, which gives you leverage over the person who has fewer points.
And also
one thing is, visually, there is something called the progressive stack. This idea of, take one step forward if you have this privilege, that privilege. And so you can almost imagine it visually as this progressive stack ritual. So, yeah.
Yeah, also one thing that I want to say, that you mentioned that if you criticize George Soros, then you be called a Nazi, even though a lot of Jews like me criticize him, etc. But one of the things that is interesting is that it also depends who is criticizing. So if you're a black person criticizing a Jew, or criticizing a Latina or a regular white person, then it's fine. But if you're a white person criticizing George Soros, for example, that's not fun. You're a Nazi. So I think also what we need to say is that it's not, it all depends on who is the criticizer. So if he's higher on the totem pole of oppression or of a victim mentality, then he's allowed, he or she are allowed to criticize the person who's under them on that totem pole, and not allowed to criticize above them.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So depending on, if you are a 3 or a 4 in the pack of cards and someone else is a jack or a queen, then they obviously trump you.
Right.
When the cards are laid on the deck. So yeah, so it's interesting. You can see that race trumps sex being a woman. So, for example, a black feminist can accuse the feminist movement of being white and racist and
Yeah.
cause a rift in the movement. A black gay person can cause a rift in the gay movement by accusing the organizers of Pride of being a bunch of white men. That shows you really that race trumps either LGBT or sex.
Right.
But if you were to say, well, could a feminist have accused Black Lives Matter of being male chauvinists and broken up the movement? Much more difficult.
Right.
Much more difficult. And I think that's, again, and now there are groups that are fighting it out, women versus trans,
Yes.
battling
J.K.
it
Rowling.
out. Yeah, battling it over, women's spaces. Is it the trans biological male who's being misogynistic for trying to enter into women's sports or women's changing room? Or is the woman who doesn't want them in the changing room transphobic? And this is where a lot of these battles are going on. It's quite interesting. But yes, that kind of reveals the sort of principle. Occasionally, in Canada, there was this, in some academic department, I can't remember the university, the Indigenous and the Black were each accusing each other, one of, and it was just fascinating to see
Yeah.
who's going to come out on top here, because
And who won?
It seems to me, I'm trying to remember. So I think there was a black person had been brought in as head of department, and the Indigenous scholars were criticizing her for marginalizing them, and then she was accusing them of being racist. It was just, you couldn't make it up. But in any case, that sort of tells you this is all about who you are, who has the sacredness, and then you have, of course, the fallen, which is the originals, people who committed the original sin. That's whites and men. White males are at the bottom of the.
And if they're straight, it's the worst.
Well, straight, yeah. I mean, that adds to it. But I still think white is the worst. Male is probably a close second. Now,
but if you're gay, then you're higher on the victim, like you said, the homophobia, etc. So you do get some points.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. You have some points, so you have some cards to play against a straight person who doesn't have any other point.
I want to, Eric, let me just, Professor Kaufmann, let me just interject with what we're seeing lately on campuses looking from Israel. My dad lives in New York, in Brooklyn, and there was protest next to his house, and my family lives close, some of my family close to NYU, so there was also all these encampments. And lately, one of the things that, I don't know if you saw this, in the Gay Pride Parade in Philadelphia. And this is an amazing video, and I recommend everyone to watch it. It's like a few seconds, less than a minute, but it's great because it shows what you're saying. So what happens is the Great Pride Parade with all the floats goes by, and then the pro-Hamas marchers block the parade, saying that the marchers, the regular, I guess, marchers, aren't sympathetic enough. How could they do this pride parade without giving the Palestinians flags and everything on the floats? And they just stop the whole parade. and there's like a stare down contest, and then the video stops. I don't know what happened, but my point
Right.
is that you have a sort of, in all these protests, like one of the things that you said, you can't make this up. You can't make up Queers for Palestine. You just can't make it up, but it's there.
Right.
And how do you see this conflict happening here? I'm not talking about the military and if the government here is good, and that's a separate issue. How do you see all the protests and the way the woke are looking at what's happening here? How do you see it playing into the whole theme that we're talking about?
So at its root, at its basic level, what woke is about is setting majorities bad or dominant groups bad, minorities good. That is the paradigm. It consists of sort of a very simple set of emotional attachments. So majorities bad means you have to fear majorities. They're scary and dangerous. Minorities good means you feel guilty about what happened to them in the past and you feel rejected and empathetic towards them. So that is the basic paradigm. And of course, we only care about racial represents essentially minorities. I mean, there's some talk about fat people and stuff. That to my mind, disabled is a non-event. They never really talk about it very much. So we're talking about historically disadvantaged race, gender, and sexual identity. Now, in this case, what we have is, and we have associated with that a set of narratives. So, for example, slavery, conquest of the indigenous, segregation, discrimination, these sorts of civil rights movement. These are the kinds of narratives. They live through film and other things, and they sort of root these emotions. So what now? It is also true that you have an intellectual kind of cultural Marxist narrative around structural oppression, and it is true that this idea of white supremacy and patriarchy are these elite academic theories that have taken the Marxist oppressor-oppressed paradigm, cartridge of class, they pulled it out of the console of oppression, they stuck the identity cartridge in. That is true, but I still think this is happening at a more basic level, which is that, oppressor, white oppressor versus person of color oppressed. White settler colonizer versus person of color indigenous oppressed. Now, that paradigm, of course, you can apply it in the United States, settling indigenous land, or in Canada, where I'm from. The paradigm would be white settlers on indigenous land, people of color, indigenous land. Now, that's sort of, you're scary, negative towards the white settler majority and protected towards that cuddly, sympathetic minority, person of color. They've taken that simple binary, good minority, bad majority, and they copied it and pasted it onto Israel-Palestine. And so what they are doing is, Jews in Israel they're the white settlers, colonizers in this morality play. And the Palestinians are like the American Indians. They're sort of the indigenous person of color. That's who we have our sympathy for. And so, it's as simple as that. Now, the West is always the bad guy, and to the extent that Israel is, seen as part of the West, they're who you attack. And that's all you need to explain what's going on.
But wait, how do you explain? I mean, I understand your answer even before you give it, but I'm going to let you explain it in a better way. How do you explain the alliances between such different groups? So I'm looking at these protests and I see Islamists with the full religious garb who in I'm just going to take, you're not allowed to be homosexual according to Islam. There are honor killings in Islam. I've had Ayan Hirsi Ali was on my podcast. She gives, the full spiel about how this should be the opposite of what they believe in. Minorities in Muslim majority countries are treated the most awful way. In Western countries, they were never treated, I think, even in the worst of the times, or at least in most of the times. And yet you have with them at the same protest people with, the funny they had in Colombia, they came out to demand food and behind her, she's demanding food. There's a guy with a bare midriff and a belly button earring or whatever it's called, piercing. And he's sitting there with a kafia and a rainbow shirt with his belly button out, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure that in Gaza you won't survive. So I mean, like, what is happening here?
Well, I think it's as simple as, well, there's a couple of things. One is this is all about victimhood. It's all about sympathy for whoever is perceived to have more victim points, and hostility to anybody seen to be the oppressor and have fewer victim points. So you have, essentially two sympathetic victim groups. One is the person of color, Palestinian. The other is the the LGBT. So you just copy and paste those things together. And you'll often see all these progressive signs, where they'll have the Black Lives Matter, refugees welcome, no one's in a league, all of these things with the LGBT stuff, trans women or women. So they only sort of, once they have a common enemy, which is essentially the white male or white male Western conservative, you name it, that's all that matters. That's all they see. Everyone else is part of this glorious rainbow. Now, we know in that rainbow we have all kinds of antagonisms. We have, Muslims who obviously came out and protested against teaching of sexuality and gay stuff in schools. You have women against trans. You have so many of these little antagonisms that exist, but those fade into the background. It was very interesting. I don't know if you saw this video of there was this kind of gay Republican he dressed up as a woman, clearly very camp gay Republican, and he was interviewing one of these queer for Palestine and saying, "Do you realize what happens to gay people
Right.
in the
Gaza.
And this person, this queer for Palestine person, didn't know. They didn't know that what the differences were between Jews and Muslims. He had to explain that Jews had a different religion from Arabs in Gaza. Like, the knowledge is essentially zero. It's just, these are the victim groups. These are the signs that I have to wave to show my ideological purity. That I'm on the side of the oppressed against the oppressor, and I'm on the side of whoever's being harmed against the mean person who's doing the harming. And that's it. And it's at that simple level. So I just think that, again, the definition of woke, what comes out of woke is this kind of pseudo-ideology, what I call woke cultural socialism, which is just about equal outcomes. So no race gaps, no gender gaps, equal outcomes, and emotional harm protection for historically marginalized race, gender, sexual identity.
Yeah, and
that's it. That's the whole ideology.
Right. But one of the things that I found interesting about what you, at least I read a few of these interviews that you gave and things that you wrote about from your new book, is that you say something that I think is very interesting. You did mention now the cultural Marxist, neo-Marxist, all that, but you say that the woke ideology that we see today is not in and of itself something that comes from this cultural Marxism. It's more of the mainstream left liberalism, right? That's basically your main thesis, is that we keep on calling in all these on the center or the normies just keep on saying, no, it's the Marxist, it's the this, we need to fight it. But you're saying, no, it's something that is a direct line from the what you called, I think, guilt.
Yes. Yeah. All we need to explain this phenomenon, I think, is essentially guilt and empathy towards minorities and fear and hostility towards the majority, which I throw men in here, white and male, essentially as the two key categories they were opposed to.
Right.
That structure has been there on the left liberal side since the mid 60s, and it has precedents that go back all the way to the first decade of the 20th century with the rise of what's called liberal progressivism. And so what I'm arguing is essentially, to explain this, it's really about left liberalism as a distinct ideology. So this is not communism. It is not classical John Stuart Mill, John Locke liberalism. It's a fusion that sometimes it's called modern liberalism. Social democracy is sort of the same kind of thing. And, economics is quite moderate. It believes in redistribution, a welfare state, but the free market. So it's actually okay. I mean, it's fairly moderate on the economy. I, in fact, would probably count myself in that place as far as economics. But on culture, left liberalism has no boundaries on its left. It is therefore what's occurred is left liberalism has evolved like a frog in boiling water. Left liberalism has kind of evolved towards increasingly, incrementally more extremist attitudes.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of evolutionary extremism, as distinct from the Chris Rufo, as Chris Rufo writes in his book, there's no question there is a connection between Black Power in the late 60s, the Black Panthers, and Black Lives Matter. That the Constitution is somehow had this idea of slavery underneath it, and the incarceration is, slanted against the black man, and all these universal principles are just smoke and mirrors. Yeah, no, there's no question that the cultural Marxist intellectuals did influence critical race and critical gender theory of our time. So you can find those intellectual links. My only point is, those people who wanted to make revolution and overthrow society and overthrow capitalism gave up on the working class, went to minorities. That's true, and they, of course, are revolutionary, but they would have gotten nowhere if they didn't have a sympathetic left liberal majority in these institutions to essentially amplify them and set out a whole bunch of taboos that they could weaponize to shut everybody else up. And so what I'm saying is kind of the cultural Marxists are the guitar players, but the entire amplification and sound system is provided by left liberalism.
Yes. And then your book is 12 Ways to Fight This Phenomena. And I'm not going to ask you to go into each one of the 12, but what is the basic gist of how, if someone is thinking of, I know it's very scary for someone to start speaking out against this stuff in the workplace. I know people who are even here are very much against some of this stuff, but they're scared they'll lose their jobs, to be frank. They're scared they'll be ostracized from their friendships a lot of times. So what can a regular person do, and what can we do?
So yeah, it's very good. I think there's both things individuals can do, and we have to fight in the culture to push back against this ideology. This is an ideology which uses euphemisms and launders its radicalism under nice-sounding labels like be kind or diversity. Who can be against diversity and equality and inclusion?
Right.
No one actually knows that, diversity and equality, diversity and equity means discriminating against whites, men, and Asians in order to meet quotas. And inclusion means censoring speech, punishing people for speech so that they don't offend a member of one of these groups. So that's DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are the policies that come in corporations and businesses.
And universities.
And universities in a big way, absolutely. What can people do? Well, I talk a lot in the book about that we need to use government, because government is the only institution that a sensible 2/3 majority of the population who opposes these ideas is the only institution they can hope to control. And you get these libertarian conservatives who I think are kind of the useful idiots for the woke cultural revolution. They think, oh, no, we're going to set up our own institutions. And that's fine with podcasts and to some degree with media. It's not going to work. We're not going to have another Google. We're not going to replace Google. We're probably not going to replace YouTube either. I mean, these are natural monopolies that have scale advantages and first mover advantages. So essentially, there's no other way around it. Now, Elon Musk, he took over Twitter. You compare Elon Musk taking over Twitter with these alternatives, Gab, Parler, Truth Social. And there's no question that Elon Musk had an enormous impact. Gab, Parler, and Truth Social nibbled around the edges. It's not a waste of time. And likewise, I think if we talk about education, there's a big debate. A lot of Americans, in particular, American conservatives say, oh, we'll just get school choice.
Right.
We'll build new universities. And first of all, it's very difficult to get a new university installed, established, and actually to make your way up the rankings. Incredibly difficult. On schools, similarly, I mean, the problem there is that, in fact, if all the teachers are trained the same way, they come with the same ideological preconception. They aren't all the same. Teachers are not all the same, but the education schools that produce the teachers essentially are pushing this ideology, and the curriculum, the materials that are available in schools are the same. And so what I find in the data, and there's a lot of data and surveys in the book, is that whether you went to private school, public school, parochial school, which is sort of religious, nominally Catholic school, those you're going to be just as woke. There's no difference I found in various data sets between young people that have gone through those three systems. And even homeschooling, there's some difference, but it's not massive. So part of my argument is, you may get a few parents who send their kids to classical school to avoid woke. Most parents aren't going to be that informed. They won't have the choices. And so most of these kids are going to be shoveled through this indoctrination mill, and they are going to come out with these woke beliefs. And that's a societal-wide problem. Regardless of whether you as a very, switched on conservative can send your kids somewhere else privately, but that's not affecting the society in any kind of scale. And so the only remedy there is to sort of do what Ron DeSantis has done, for example, ban critical race theory in schools.
In universities, you mean, right? He banned it in the state universities.
Yeah, universities is different. I think universities is trickier because academics have academic freedom and students can choose what they want to study. So I wouldn't say to do this for the university system.
But in public schools.
For the public school system, the government should be actively monitoring and shaping the curriculum, monitoring indoctrination. Teachers who indoctrinate need to be fired. That needs to be made public. That kind of thing is necessary in order to clean out the indoctrination from the school system, which is generating a young generation, which is vastly more intolerant than older generations. So, just to take one example that I use all the time, should J.K. Rowling be dropped by her publisher, young people under 25 are split 50-50 on that in Britain.
In Britain,
yeah. Anyone over 45, it's almost nobody who believes that J.K. Rowling should be dropped. But that kind of shows you the sort of steepness of this generational curve. I call it a kind of ticking time bomb. And when this Zoomer generation hits the workforce, when they become the median voter, the entire society is going to be in trouble. I think it's going to lose the traditions of free speech and due process and equal treatment, patriotism, all of those things are going to be dramatically eroded. So we have to start turning things around amongst the young generation, and that means getting at the schools. And conservatives have just been asleep at the switch, or they've been living in a fantasy land that we're going to have a school choice or something. Universities are different. I think the approach has to be slightly different on universities. You can go after DEI, remove that. You can actually, I think, without banning critical race theory, but you can actually say, we're not going to fund this kind of course. So if you at the university want to subsidize it, you go ahead, but we're not providing any government funding for that or for student loans for people who want to take that. So I think there are ways of disincentivizing that still respect academic freedom.
What other, that is all educational and the education system. What about one of the things that I think is for sure driving this, and you mentioned it, is the culture. So people are, if I put on Netflix, and I love Netflix, but a lot of their shows have criteria for DEI, and you'll see that they all have to have a character that meets a certain criteria. The one of the big examples was, I think it was Snow White, where the dwarfs were all different race identities, and then the dwarf community got angry because they were losing their jobs. And it's not even funny because the dwarfs don't have a lot of parts, and they lost all their money. This was like the main thing for the dwarfs, and because they wanted to put a black dwarf and a lesbian dwarf and a trans dwarf, which weren't dwarfs, but they had to fill those quotas. They lost all their money. But my point is that, and one other thing is that when I was in the U.S. not too long ago, commercials. There is no white men in any commercial right now in the U.S. It's like a thing. And my point is that what can we do to, I guess, I know that, for example, the Daily Wire, they have this thing where they're trying to make children's stuff that is less crazy. But where do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, we have to have, it's the both fan strategy. You've got to use all the tactics you have. So government can do some things. They can defund academic research, arts councils, museums, anyone who's engaging in DEI, they can defund all of that. They can put stricter conditions and monitor, cut funding, all of that stuff. In terms of the culture more broadly. Yeah, you're right. We do need things like alternative stories, alternative commercials. Maybe consumer boycotts, for example. That's obviously made an impact with Bud
Bud
Light.
Light, yeah.
Target. So there's some consumer. I mean, one of the big themes that you notice is the left is simply much more organized. They punch 5 times above their weight on Twitter. They're involved in any kind of body that is consultative. They're going to be overrepresented. And this is one of the reasons why governments need to centralize power back into executive government and away from any kind of devolved body, expert commissions, anything like that. Citizens' juries, these are all things, any sort of devolved body is going to be overrepresented. The left will be overrepresented. And so you've got to target power away from them into the elected representative. The other thing is, yeah, I think, again, every day there is a battle is being played out in the media, on the internet. The internet's a major resource. So what you're doing and what Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan, that's extremely important. This conversation is extremely important. But I think conservatives need to be much more mobilized. Perhaps consumer boycotts is one part of that. Another part of that is putting pressure on your representatives, actually, to care about the culture war, to crack down on DEI and critical race theory at schools and universities, on ESG, this sort of ESG requirements for corporations. All of these things are happening in the U.S. red states, which I think are the policy leaders. It's only started in the last couple of years. So that needs to all become much more aggressive. The thing and here's a point that Richard Hanania makes in his book, if you look at Republican states, 14 of them have abortion bans, even though in the U.S. population, only about a third of the U.S. population wants an abortion ban. So the religious right and the gun lobby and the low tax lobby are really punching at or above their weight. So these are very effective conservative lobby groups. Now, on the other hand, only 4 states have banned affirmative action. Now, affirmative action is opposed by 2/3 of the American electorate. That's an easy one. Why haven't those other Republican states done it? And that's, either they have historically been afraid of, even the Republicans, afraid of being accused of being a racist. Number 2, there isn't the conservative lobby organizations and lobby groups that can hold their congressional representatives to account for not doing anything. What you need is something like, the religious right or the National Rifles Association to score all of the Republican representatives and say, okay, what have they been saying and doing on critical race theory, of DEI? How are they voting? And that will pull our pressure when it comes time for them to be running in a primary and to face their constituencies, their districts. If they're the people who are voting in those primaries are informed that they're weak on culture war issues, that can damage them. And I think that's where we need to be going, is a between elections, more mobilization, more lobbying, more pressuring of representatives to ensure that they pursue this politics. And that, I think, will make a big difference. So, yeah, we've got to win the battle of ideas, of course, but we also have to do the political stuff. Last thing I'll say is vivid images and catchphrases are very important, because a lot of people don't understand. They don't know how to make sense of all this. So Chris Rubel's right to use a phrase like DEI or critical race theory, which is a collecting label for a whole bunch of stuff, and then to have that have a negative connotation, and people can repeat it, and that becomes a buzzword. The other thing is, vivid images. So I did an experiment where, in Canada we had this trans teacher with size 9 prosthetic teaching in a school. Yeah. If you ask people whether they should be allowed to teach, it's like 50-50, yes and no. You show a picture, it goes to like 8-1, 80-10. So that's what I mean, is using these techniques to cut through the euphemisms that the other side will use to launder their ideas and obscure what they're doing. So these are just some of the tactics. I mean, I go into more detail in the book.
Yeah.
And there's many other things that need to be done, but the politics of this really has to get a lot more organized.
I wanted to ask you something about a previous book that you did, because we are coming to an election in America, and one of the and Europe, we're seeing also this phenomenon, not in Great Britain where the opposite maybe is happening, but I'll put that aside for now. But we did see that in Holland, and the European election to the European Parliament, now in France and Belgium, etc., and with the election in 2016 of Trump and his back to popularity now, and we'll see. But one of the things that you wrote in your book, if I remember correctly, is called Whitewashed, right? In the 2018 it came
White
out, if I
Shift,
remember.
2018, I
Shift.
think. Yeah.
And I found it, first of all, I have to say that the subjects that you pick are so dangerous to even touch them. I don't know how you have the courage, but I appreciate it. So I
That's why
guess
I moved to university, but no, but go
oh,
ahead. Go ahead.
so I guess my question is, if you can, because one of the things that you said is that the woke culture is always against the majority and for the minority. And one of the things that you pointed out, if I remember correctly, in your former book, was that the white population in America and maybe in the West at large is becoming a minority. So how do the, I mean, I'm putting the woke aside, but what could you maybe explain to us, what do white people, and as a whole, if we could overgeneralize, what do they feel now in the West, and what are the consequences?
Well, you're right that in a way, behind the rise of the populist right, which the initial populist moment was in 2014. I mean, that's not to say there wasn't an increase in votes in the period from the late 80s to the early 2000s. We did see in some countries like Italy and Austria, we did see a certain rise in the populist right, but it's really been since 2014 that we've seen the populist right doing well in almost every European country and in the US as well. That's about immigration, and immigration, why? Mainly for cultural reasons, and mainly because of this demographic shift, the decline of white majorities. The US case, for example, we know that by roughly 2050, non-Hispanic whites will be falling below 50%. Now, we can have a debate over, and I think it is a worthwhile debate to have, about Hispanics and people who are half white and half Asian, because there is a lot of literature to suggest that they're more or less becoming part of that white group. So it may not quite happen in 2050 in America, but it is happening at a certain speed in all these countries. And in Europe, it'll happen towards the end of the century. That is creating a kind of ethnic anxiety, which is fueling the rise of national populism, symbolized by the issue of immigration. And that is the main factor. Now, what we've seen after the pandemic got people thinking about the economy and health. When people are thinking about the economy and health, actually, they are not as focused on culture, and the populist right is going to decline. Not crash. Populist right share went down a certain amount. Post-pandemic, we've had a surge of immigration across many countries. And that is why we see this surge of populism. What happens is the immigration level goes up, and people who already say they want less immigration, but immigration is their number 5, 6 issue, it becomes their number 1, 2 issue. Once immigration rises up people's priority lists, the populists do well. It's not a perfect correlation, but that's the strongest predictor. So yeah, I think as long as we have significant immigration, we're going to have significant populism. It's a very similar explanation in the US as in Europe. Now, one thing I'd say about Britain is it's true that Labour is coming into government, the left is coming into government, but what's going on in Britain is that the mainstream right has essentially betrayed their electorate,
Yes.
allowed immigration to rise dramatically. So they're being punished for betraying their electorate on immigration. It's not the only factor, but it is a major factor. And the main beneficiary of that is the Reform UK under Nigel Farage, who now have pulled even with the Conservatives. So they really increased their support. I think the big story of the UK election could be that Reform UK could become the opposition. They could get more seats certainly more votes than the Conservative Party, probably more seats. So that is going to be a dramatic event. So I wouldn't say that Britain is really an exception to this.
Yeah. Maybe before if I ask you just about why a little bit more, but is this because on the left they would say, okay, this proves that the white majority is a racist majority. They hate Hispanics, they hate black people, they're becoming minority, they're racist, and therefore all this woke stuff we spoke about until now is right. And so what would you say to that proposition?
Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing I would say, well, I would start by I'll start by the way with just talking but before I answer that question, this relationship between woke and the populist right. It's not so much that voters are voting because they hate woke for the populist right, but what woke does is it makes it impossible for the mainstream to address immigration levels in a convincing manner, to deport people, for example, because they'll be accused of being insensitive to minorities. And
Right.
so what that does is it essentially opens up this completely untapped market for populists to rush into, creates a political vacuum. So actually woke is behind the rise of populism. And
Yeah.
it's a very, it's an indirect effect, but it is essentially driving populism indirectly by shutting down the ability of the mainstream to go to where the voters are on immigration. Now, to the question of, does this prove that the majorities are racist? No, it doesn't, for a number of reasons. I mean, the main reason I would say is, if you actually look at psychological research, there's a difference between disliking an outgroup and being attached to your in. And I do not believe that being attached to one's in-group is the same as being racist. So, for example, if I am attached to my family very strongly, so the first thing to say is attachment to the in-group is not correlated with hatred of out-group,
Yes.
except in times of war. And so, for example, if you look at the American National Election Study, which is the gold standard study for a survey for American political science, they have these thermometer questions. How warm or cool do you feel towards Hispanic, Black, Republican, Democrat, whites? White Americans who feel warmer towards white Americans on the 0 to 100 thermometer actually feel slightly warmer towards Blacks and Hispanics than white Americans who feel cooler towards white people on that thermometer. And so what I'm saying is that attachment and warm feelings towards your own in-group is not correlated with hostility to the out group. And actually, that finding is a standardized, well-repeated finding in psychology. There's a paper by Marilyn Brewer on in-group love and out-group hate that goes through this. Now, on the other hand, people who are more attached to being Republican and feel warmer towards Republicans do feel colder towards Democrats. So on certain dimensions, there is a zero-sum relationship, but on race, there isn't. And so actually, what's happening, and actually Jardina, who's, an impeccably liberal political scientist, really wrote a book about this, saying, to explain the Trump phenomenon, we need to sort of parse out the separate dimensions of racism from white identity. White identity, which is actually a separate dimension from racism. And so what I think we're seeing with the rise of populism is people who are attached to a way of life, attached to a country as they've known it, attached to their group, and they don't want as much immigration and change. It's not because they hate the out group. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't people who hate the out group as well. There are going to be those. But this
You're
is
talking
not,
about the mainstream.
yeah, so the mainstream white majority populations who are voting, and only a subset of them are voting for national populism, they are predominantly voting to preserve something they're attached to. And that is not racism as I'm defining it. Because if that's racism, then a Hispanic who's attached to being Hispanic, a Black who's attached to being Black, they're racist as well. And this is ridiculous. I mean, in-group preference, if you're going to call that racist, then that I think debases the meaning of the term.
Right.
And it's used very selectively. So if you ask white progressives, if you say a Latino American wants more immigration because they want to bolster their group's numbers in the country, is that racist? Almost not. Maybe 15% of them will say that's racist. If you say a white American wants to reduce immigration to America to help their numbers maintain themselves as a share of the population, is that
That's
racist?
racist.
Like 3/4, yeah, that's right. It's totally inconsistent. It's exactly the same principle. You're in-group focused, and you're looking out for its demographic interest. But they're calling one group who does it, Latinos wanting to boost immigration to boost their numbers. That's not racist. Whites wanting to limit immigration to protect their numbers. That is. So All I'm saying
Yeah.
is, I think it's a ridiculous claim, but they get away with it, and it's not really being challenged. I mean, a lot of the populist right, a lot of the politicians, Nigel Farage, for example, he'll always say, "Oh, why are you against immigration? Pressure on housing and public services. That's the acceptable rationale." But I think that's the main reason people want less immigration. And
Well,
I could go through more experimental evidence that would show that, but yeah.
I have maybe just to dig down on it. Does the number of immigration matter in terms of the culture? Let's put economics aside. Like you said, talk about the culture. So I guess in the last, in America, you had varying degrees of legal immigration. I'm thinking about the Asian community, the Irish, the Italians. All these groups came. There was tension between groups all the time. There was, people didn't. President Kennedy was. People were against him because he was Catholic and he was a minority. So, I guess my question is, does it matter now, the fact that we're seeing all this? Does the sheer number of immigrants that are coming in and not assimilating because there's so much immigration, and so that people live in their own communities, they continue speaking their foreign languages and don't assimilate, does that matter?
I think it depends which element of that you're talking about. I mean, certainly in a lot of countries, the language issue, I mean, it does matter in the sense that there's more difference in one's environment. And depending on how you're psychologically wired, this is up to half heritable. Um, there is a significant number of people who, in a way, are wired to prefer order over disorder at a very basic level. Now, this is sometimes referred to as authoritarianism, which is a sort of very loaded term that progressive
Right.
academics use. But essentially, what it is a preference for order-seeking behavior. So difference is seen as disorderly. And then there's another orientation about wanting the present to be continuous with the past. So let's take a question like, American culture was better in the past. If you agree with that statement, you are dramatically more likely to support Donald Trump and to be opposed to current levels of immigration. It is one of the best questions.
But wait,
Yeah.
let me just ask you, what do you mean then by culture? Because if you're saying that the language is not, it is an issue, but it's not the main issue. What do you mean when you say culture?
Okay, so there's a couple of dimensions here. If we just take language, the second generation largely speaks the language,
Hmm.
essentially. I mean, in most countries. I mean, this is not really an enormous issue. Now,
Okay.
it is true, of course, that if you have a very large number of people, you're going to hear lots of languages in public. And if you don't like disorder, that's not going to make you happy. But there's also a second question, which is, okay, let's say, language, second generation picks up the language. The question then becomes one of, well, what about religious differences? Say, Muslim, Christian. Those
Yeah.
are not going to fade away, but, through assimilation. So you then have a secondary question around, okay, fine. So it's okay if it's a small group. What if they become a large group? And the projections for Muslim share in, say, a place like Britain or Sweden in 2050 for Q4, the median projection is putting it around 20%. That is like a tripling, almost a tripling of where it is now. Okay. And in certain concentrations, certain cities, that could be approaching 50%. Now, the question we have here is, assimilation is going to deal with language. It's not going to deal with religion. And if that's considered an issue, and I think it is an issue that people would say, we're okay with a certain proportion, we're not okay with a large or significant proportion, because that is not sort of, in a way, that is not our tradition. Now, if we take sort of ethnicity and race, the question there is, I think, one of, again, it's all about critical mass. It's finding minorities, and it's also about assimilation. What is the speed of intermarriage and melting
Hmm.
into the majority group? And is the immigration ahead of the assimilation? Then diversity builds up in the system, and there's more disorder, and people who prefer order and prefer the past to be like the present are going to be upset by that. And so that's kind of what I mean, and they're better than in terms of populism. Um, so
So by
yeah,
culture,
yeah.
is there any factor of, is there any meaning of culture in the sense of political, or maybe how people look at the system of government? So for example, or just for example, people who come to the U.S. from countries in South America, which are authoritarian in the not the psychological sense, but really authoritarian, where free speech is something that is not it's not something that is done. Or people, I mean, Cubans are more Republican, but let's say Venezuelans coming in from a communist country now, where people are put in jail for dissent. So do they, a lot of them maybe come with their own set of ideals from back home, and then people are scared. People are saying it's not just culture, people looking different, but actually the ideas that they bring with them.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a huge driver. I'm not, certain groups like Venezuelans actually are quite Republican.
Okay, but my point
But I
is,
think, but I'm not sure. I think that we had in the U.S. there is a concern certainly over are immigrants all going to be Democrats, and are they going to? Yeah, this question about freedom of speech. What are their
right?
mores like? I think that is an element of it, and maybe I'm saying that perhaps that's more of an issue if you take, say, Muslim immigration in Europe and a concern over
Yeah.
attitudes to homosexuals and Jews and women and free, that is perhaps the bigger issue. But I'm not sure. I still think a lot of it is really down to, it takes several generations for true assimilation to occur. I mean, even in the U.S. case, if you take the Southern and Eastern Europeans, Catholics and Jews who came in the very early 20th century period, it's taken like 3 or 4 generations for ethnic neighborhoods to break up, intermarriage to occur, adultery to occur. I don't think we should expect that to be faster necessarily for the groups coming in now. And so these things take time. And by the way, government cannot really do much to integrate. And this is one of these things. People say, "Oh, well, we'll just have an integration program." Doesn't work. I mean,
Yeah.
you might get them into the labor market. You might get them even to say that they're British and feel British. But what you won't get is a decline, for example, in segregation, increases in intermarriage. All of those actually deeper indicators of melting take much, much longer. And I think are vital, actually, because I actually think you need to have this, ethnic majority, open assimilation and melting, but without that majority anchor in the system, I think you sort of have a lot of tendencies. If you look at countries, Kenya or Trinidad, or countries where you have a number of different groups contending for power, politics runs on ethnic lines. It's harder to get agreements. The society doesn't function as well generally. And so I just think if we have too much diversity injected into the system without assimilation, which can only happen organically, in my view, and therefore that's why you need to take your foot off the immigration accelerator to allow that assimilation to take place. And it's the buildup of diversity in the system that is driving polarization of populism.
I have to say that a lot of what you said is stuff that I might agree with, but I would be scared to say it. So thank you for saying it. And I think but maybe just 2 more questions.
Yeah.
Number one is that does the fact that, at least in the polls, we'll see if it comes out in the election in November, but does the fact that in the polls, Trump is carrying a significant portion of Hispanics, and the fact that in the polls I've seen now, majority of Hispanics support mass immigration of illegal immigrants. So at least in some of the polls. So
restricting immigration.
no, there's a poll now that came out. I will send it to you because it's interesting. That showed that over 50% of Hispanics support deportation, the Trump deportation plan of mass deportation. Yeah. So it's not just stopping illegal immigrants; it's kicking them out. And that I think was never the case at this and this proportion. So does that change any of the way you look at this? Meaning that maybe this shows that the mainstream of the Hispanic community in the U.S., which that is the main force of immigration, in America, does that maybe show that they're becoming assimilated? They feel American and they don't want other people to come in. They want to be the Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely shows that. And this is so the question, there's different layers and levels of assimilation, but there is significant intermarriage, Hispanic and non-Hispanic whites. And you're right. So essentially, it's the U.S.-born third-generation Hispanics that are more likely to be Republican.
Oh yeah,
Protestant Hispanics are more likely to be Republican. And Hispanics, there's also a relationship between, there have been papers on this, to the extent they identify as Republican, they're more likely to put their race as white, for example. So, and one thing I didn't mention really is that there's something I mentioned in the book White Shift, which is essentially what I term white ethno-traditional nationalism. That is to say, you can be Hispanic or Asian, you enter America, it looked a certain way, it had a certain culture. You become attached to that and you want to preserve it. And it can come on. Why would a Hispanic, want to preserve a white majority in the United States? It doesn't make any sense, but as it does, in a way, your picture of the whole, the nation that you're attached to, has a certain traditional ethnic composition, which you don't want to change too rapidly. So, for example, there were surveys taken in that I've looked at the numbers in 2017. Hispanic and Asian Trump supporters were as likely as white Trump supporters to say that white people are under attack in the United States. 70% agreement amongst Hispanic and Asian Trump voters, same as white Trump voters.
Wow.
Support to preserve and protect European Christian heritage in America. Majority of Hispanic and Asian Trump voters are agreeing with that statement. Now, what's going on, and similarly when we talk about the border and immigration, what's going on there is, I think, yes, an assimilation process, and particularly Hispanics that sort of see themselves as more or less part of the majority or moving that direction. Yes, and so I think this is an indicator of a kind of assimilation. There's also been studies of people who are mixed, Hispanic and white, or Asian and white, and there too you see a gravitation, I think, towards the white side. Not totally. It's inflected by politics, but yeah, so these are all indications that, I would never say, I think assimilation is happening as it has in the past. So, but one of the questions is breaking down segregated neighborhoods, large-scale intermarriage, to the point where you actually get a common outlook. I still think that does take a number of generations. Of course, it's happening, and it is happening at a significant scale. So I would say that's again one of the reasons is if we can slow the immigration down and allow those kinds of melting processes to get the upper hand, we can move towards a more cohesive, less polarized society. If we keep having significant immigration, then I think that simply makes it impossible for that to happen at the scale required.
One last question before I let you go, because we're talking a lot, and I could talk to you for hours because it's one of the more interesting subjects that I think anyone who is someone who wants to preserve the West, it's something that we should be talking about either way. But one of the things that I do want to talk before we finish is that I saw somewhere where you mentioned about Israeli society. I saw you mentioned ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, their share of the population going up. And I don't remember the exact context, but I guess maybe I'll ask it this way. The birth rates in America are very, very low, but they're still very, very high, and even maybe going higher, I'm not sure, among, for example, ultra-Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn. I'm just where I grew up. I had a hat, a jacket, a big beard. It took me time to get over that, but all my friends are
really interesting.
Yeah, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in Crown Heights, in a Lubavitch neighborhood. So I saw the Rebbe. I was at his funeral. But my point is that all my friends have tons of kids who I grew up with. They live in America. They live in New York City, the Big Apple, and yet they live their own. You were talking about assimilation. There is zero assimilation in the sense of intermarriage. It's like it's not existent statistically. There's a lot of children, and there's a preservance of the way of life that is going on from generation to generation. And I assume that also happens in also some Christian communities that are more, maybe we'll say, fundamentalist or etc. And obviously in the Muslim community, the religious Muslim community. So when we look at that and we juxtapose it with the majority of Americans not having children, a lot of the young people living the life that we spoke about in terms of woke culture, does the fact that religious people who are, it's antithetical to wokeness, does that give you any maybe hope that the next, in 2 or 3 generations, all the kids are going to be religious people? So the whole West is going to change.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, at least for me, that carries some dangers as well, right? So I think
Tell me
that
about it.
because I wouldn't want to live in that world.
Exactly.
But yeah, this is so Israel is a good example of where religious demography. I did a book, I don't know if you're aware, called Shall Religious Inherit the Earth in 2010, which really looked at this exact issue
Uh-huh.
of how within religions, those who are fundamentalist or world denying, particularly modernity denying, tend to have higher birth rates. And in a world where birth rates are sinking amongst the majorities, the strict religious groups are going to be a larger share of the population. Now, in Israel, where you have the ultra Orthodox and it's a relatively small country,
Yes.
the impact is being seen first. And so they are having an impact at a compositional level. Their share of first graders, their share of population is rising and will make a dramatic
And
impact.
it's causing, I'll just interject just for listeners and viewers that are not in Israel, we're in the midst of a war. And in the midst of the war, the Supreme Court is right now talking about the conscription. So the army says it doesn't have enough soldiers. Tons of soldiers have either been killed or lost limbs, so we're not able to use them in the line of duty, and they need more soldiers. And you have an entire population that is growing, as you said, as a share of the population that doesn't go to the army. There is a conscription, but they are ideologically opposed. And so the Supreme Court has been petitioned. They keep on saying they need to go to the army. Nothing happens. There's the it's not just a judicial question. It's a question of society and how the impact of the fact that they are growing in numbers, how it's going to affect just the relation between the government and the people here. So it's a big thing.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's like almost a ticking time bomb in the sense that, you run the clock forward a couple of generations. These things are logarithmic.
Yes.
So more kids, more mothers, more kids, more mothers, and you get that huge shift. Now, something similar if you take the United States, for example, those groups are smaller as a share of the total. So if you take the Amish, who have a doubling, generally doubling every 25, 30 years as a population, there may be several hundred thousand. When I wrote my book in 2010, there were 250,000. Maybe there's now 400,000. Now,
That's
it
not
doesn't seem like
significant.
much. It isn't much, but if you actually will follow that curve, we get into the 2200s and there's 300 million of them. So, I mean, it's kind of, and the ultra Orthodox, and there are a few groups like that, Hutterites, and there aren't that many such groups, by the way, and they don't exist in Islam that I'm aware of. There are no real very high fertility minorities like that.
The
But yes, now
Muslims in America don't have high fertility rates?
not really. You'd be surprised because if you look around the Muslim world now, actually, a lot of places the birth
Yeah.
rate is, obviously
Iran,
Iran,
Turkey.
Turkey, but even in the Gulf Arab states, quite a number of them, it's at around replacement. North Africa. So there's a lot of the Muslim world which doesn't have actually that high fertility. I mean, you may be aware that Palestinian fertility has gone down and is lower than
Yes.
the Jewish. And that's a reflection, I think, of this broader trend that you don't have a group like that in the Muslim world.
Wow.
Um, and now, so the question then is, and we're seeing the birth rates really going down to very low levels I mean,
In
it's worse,
Europe.
lowest in East Asia, but then in Southern Europe is very low as well. So Southern Europe is extremely low. The U.S., Northern Europe is not as low. It's like around somewhere between 1.5 and 2. Maybe it's closer to 1.5 now. That's low, but it's not catastrophically low. But still, what that means is that the gap between, if everyone's, the very religious are having 6 kids and the non-religious are having 4 or 5 on the frontier, it doesn't make much difference. But when the very religious are having, let's say, even 3 kids and the non-religious are having 1, that's a 300% difference. And that's going to drive major change. I think that's going to make a difference. Like in the US and across the West, people who go to church regularly have around a replacement two children per woman on average. But people who say they have no religion is closer to 1. So that creates a big yes. Now, So in the long run, woke is in trouble in terms of not having to
But it'll
reproduce.
take time, and the replacement might not be that much better a lot of times.
Yeah, because of, particularly with somebody who's Christian, say in America, there's significant numbers of people, that are switching and becoming non-religious. There are
Right.
significant numbers of conservatives at college that switch and move to the left, become liberal, for example. That switching behavior would have to slow down in order for this differential birth rate effect to really drive an increase in conservatism. Now, there are some signs of this possibly happening. So just the fact now that a lot of Democratic women will not date a Republican. There's maybe a growing political boundary in the dating market, which is correlated with being Christian as well. If you're Christian and you're young, if you say you're Christian as opposed to no religion, you're much more likely to be Republican. So it may be that in the U.S., we're going to see this dynamic, the Israel-style dynamic take place.
Wow. But like you said, in Israel, it's because we're such a small country, the differences are making more of an impact faster.
Yeah.
So do you know of any other country, just as a last question, that the difference between religious groups and the birth rates are making so much social tension like here? Or is this the best
Well,
example?
not religious, but ethnicity, yes. And
In birth rates or in
there
immigration?
differences so you have ethnic differences in birth rates. Let's just take a few examples, or immigration rate differences. I mean, clearly the U.S. that's driven some change. The decline of the
Hispanics.
white population, but
Yeah.
let's take Northern Ireland, which was 2/3 Protestant in 1965 and is now around 50-50 Protestant Catholic. Has now had a Sinn Féin government, first minister of big political changes that come on the back of birth rate differentials.
Wow.
Clearly, we can look at other places. Lebanon is another. Lebanese civil war as a
Yes.
result of declining Christian population. Even in former Yugoslavia, you can make the case that Serbs declining in Kosovo and Bosnia was a factor. So there are a lot of Ivory Coast civil war, the Muslim share increasing dramatically due to illegal immigration. So there are plenty of places where these sorts of ethnic dynamics have produced tension, much worse than in Israel. I mean, leading to violence in places like Ivory Coast and Lebanon. So,
Yeah.
I don't know why quite. I mean, one of the big questions in Israel is whether you will ever get a faction within the ultra Orthodox that will break away and become more mainstream.
Modernized. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or more Israeli in their identity. For example, so there is what happens is, I think, and I spoke about this with a guy that does demographics here. He did it for the central statistic, like the equivalent of Central Statistic Bureau, I guess, of the country. And he said that when the population grows, the margins grow too. So you'll have more people from the ultra-Orthodox community saying that they want to study in academics, or that they want to go to the army, or they want to go to work, but that still is the same proportion of them. There's just more people. So there's more people that are, but you're not getting the mainstream. The rabbis are still controlling the situation. So the rabbis have the same way that they looked at it before, and there's no change. But I do think that maybe when they understand that there's no way of doing things, there's not enough money, there's not enough taxpayers, at some point the money finishes. And the war, for example, is costing us lots of money. There's going to need to be lots of cuts and tax hikes, and it's not going to be sustainable. And so we'll see. I don't know, but it is a difficult situation.
This is really the question, is how this goes. We can look historically and see groups like the Mennonites and the Mormons, where you get a modernizing faction that
Right.
maybe a significant chunk of the population that becomes more modern. I think for various reasons, I don't necessarily see that happening as easily. One of the reasons that, I don't know, it could happen, there's moderation that occurs among some sects. It could happen. There are no signs of it happening amongst the Amish or the ultra-Orthodox. I think one of the reasons is that the more powerful the secular culture is, the more that actually gets the backup of these groups. is a stimulus for fundamentalism.
It's a little bit like what you said about the woke making an incentive for the populists. Because so when an ultra orthodox person here looks at academia, he sees that they're trying to push on him certain I'm not excusing it, but I think the natural inclination a lot of times, at least by the leaders, is I'm staying away. I don't want my people to be totally brainwashed. And looking at the army, a lot we're saying, oh my God, there's all these gender stuff in the army now. I'm not getting close to there. And so that is something I think that we do have to, it's something that maybe should be checked.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that's, you know, I mean, the part of the problem too is, of course, the very secular society is
Yes.
seen as very alien, and so that's also makes them more defensive and makes them want to draw harder lines to that sort of fallen, depraved
Yeah.
society, right? And so again, whereas if everyone was kind of moderately religious, like some Amish who have converted, I mean, they become evangelical Christians. So if the society was evangelical Christian, I think more Amish would actually feel comfortable leaving, and they would be
Right.
okay. So,
Anyway, so we'll see. We're living history, like as we're talking. I think the difference a lot of times about what we're talking about now, as opposed to maybe 100 years from now, is that the change is so rapid, and the way also people change their minds a lot of times about these issues just because of what they feel and see. Things you were talking about now, we could look at, like you said, 2014, even maybe a little 2013, a lot less than it is now in terms of the tensions. You're talking about immigration, and here the ultra orthodox were a lot less a share of the population. The growing is happening much faster than maybe 100 years before. So it is. Anyway, it was a very, very interesting conversation, I have to say. And I have to say that I think that what we spoke about, like I said, maybe 5 times already, is things that are going to go with us in the future. So you have a lot of new books ahead of you. So
thanks. Yeah, I mean, there's one of the things, I'm very interested in demography, population change, how it affects society, but also these ideologies and how they intersect.
Right.
This the woke thing, which intersects with the immigration thing, right? And it really is one of the reasons that we haven't been able to have a conversation about immigration that's sensible, is because of the predecessor to woke, which is political correctness. It's intimately connected. But yeah, so I think these are interesting things to study, and I've got like I'm doing a course, that I'm giving a course on woke 15 weeks. That's the kind of thing we need to be looking at dispassionately, analytically. So yeah, there's plenty to chew on.
Yeah, you have a lot of work ahead of you. So thank you so much, Professor Kaufmann, for speaking with us. And I do hope that one day you will come to Israel and we'll be able to host you. It'll be a great honor, and I'll organize the hall and the people that will come, so you'll have a packed house. Because I do think that it's important that, even though Israelis have, I think, more social cohesion if we put aside the ultra-Orthodox thing, but we have gone through lots of social protests. A lot of it, I think, has to do with the woke issue, but undercurrents that are coming from the rest of the West here through academia a lot of times. So I do think that it's interesting to talk about from both sides, just to hear how it's affecting the way we think and how to deal with it. So thank you so much for coming and talking with us, and I appreciate the time you gave us. And thank you so much for our listeners and our viewers, and subscribe, and we'll have more of these great conversations in the future. So thank you so much.